Well, it's my pleasure to be here today, and I brought my tambourine up here in case anyone goes to sleep. I'm going to give it a slap. And I'm also comforted by any kind of a musical instrument. So it's great to be with you today, and I don't think I've said enough about how glad I am to be a part of this church and a part of this ministry team. I've never had the collegiality that I have with these two guys in my past ministry, and it means a lot to me to be able to discuss things and share thoughts and feelings about our ministry together. And when we do our Wednesday night study, they're both usually there. They may fall asleep, but I'm going to bring the tambourine to that too. But we have a really good time together, and same with you. It's so good to be with you, working together to do the work of the Lord. It's a great thing, and I wouldn't be anywhere else. Amen. All right. Well, today I want to talk about sight and asking the wrong question and lots of fun things. So let's take just a moment to pray together. Lord, it's my prayer that today the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together may be pleasing in your sight. Amen. Okay, we're reading today from John 9 to start out, and so let's take a look at this story. We read from the Message today. Walking down the street, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. Now, some people have made much of the fact that nobody pointed out this man to Jesus. Jesus saw him, and he saw not first someone with a problem, but he saw a human being. And I think that's legitimate. We're not told how it is known that this man is blind from birth, but as the story goes on in the chapter, it does seem to be common knowledge in the community that he is not merely blind, but one who was born physically blind. Okay, we go on to the next slide. His disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind?" Now that is a very strange thing to ask Jesus. Here you have someone who is born blind. Now how could that person have sinned if they were born blind? They didn't have a chance to sin, and I can tell. Some people have tried to spin a lot out of that. Jesus simply says in the next slide, you're asking the wrong question. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause-effect here. And I think that's an important thing I want to point out. That's why we have the title, Asking the Wrong Question, because that's what they were doing. We oftentimes see something in the world and we immediately jump to the blame game, playing the blame game. Who is to blame for this situation? I think we're so good at that. Perhaps it's human nature that causes us to look for someone to place the blame on. Jesus disqualifies that here. And I think we could expand upon that to disqualify that question in our lives in general, to not spend our energies looking for who to blame about everything. We might be made uncomfortable when it comes out to be that some things are actually our fault. That'll make you uncomfortable for sure. So Jesus says you're asking the wrong question. Well, what about the right question? Next slide, he says, look instead for what God can do. So he's taken this negative question and he's replacing it with a positive one. Instead of trying to blame somebody, let's look at what we are faced with and see what God can do in that situation. He says we need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. Now, we're not exactly sure what he means by that, while the sun shines. In my own life, I tend to apply it to as long as I'm alive walking around this planet, I can do something to make a difference here. And so this is when I need to do it. You know, I don't need to defer that until I am facing St. Peter to try and deal with the world's problems. That would be foolish, wouldn't it? Yeah, and I know I worked the St. Peter thing in here there, so. Have we got any St. Peter fans? All those jokes about St. Peter at the gate. A lot of good material there. He goes on to say, next slide, when night falls, the workday is over. For as long as I am in the world, there's plenty of light. I am the world's light. The saying, I'm the light of the world, is one of the things that we see repeatedly in this Gospel of John. And in another place, in the Sermon on the Mount, he turns that around and points it at us. Jesus says, you are the light of the world. So that's a sobering thought. You know, when he was here, he was the light of the world, and his people now, full of his spirit, his way of thinking and trying to live, we now are the light of the world. And so that light is not something that's been extinguished with him physically leaving this life, but it continues in us. Okay, so he stops talking and he does something with this situation. Next slide. He said this, and then spit in the dust, made a clay paste with the saliva, rubbed the paste on the blind man's eyes, and said, go, wash at the pool of Siloam. All right, now this is perhaps a little bit gross to some of us. Yeah, if it works, it works. How many of you played in the dirt when you were a kid? Is that something that we all had a part of? Yeah.
Who ate the dirt?
Yeah, who ate the dirt? A lot of minerals in that dirt, I hear. I chose as the picture today the hands in the clay. And you know, you want to tell Jesus, go wash your hands, you know. But he wasn't afraid to do that as a part of this situation. He was willing to get down and dirty, down to the ground and dirty with his hands to make a difference in this guy's life. And we continue, next slide. Siloam means sent. Now that's kind of an oddball note thrown in there, but at this point he has sent this man to do something. He has done something to him, and he has sent him off to this pool to wash. And so I think that's the tie-in there. And lo and behold, the man went and washed and saw. Okay, now there's more to the story in the chapter, but I want to just keep our focus there today. He was told to do something by the one that was seeking to help him. He responded, and it made a difference. And I think that was wise. He went and he washed and he saw. How many of you have ever been to the doctor? Anybody? The doctor? Or the dentist? And what do? You know, they always tell you to do something. Do you do it? Sobering thought there. Well, this guy did it. He went, he washed, and he saw. How about us? This story reminds me of an Old Testament story that I think helped me to kind of understand it a little bit better, and I want to look at that. It's from 2 Kings chapter 5. So let's get the slide for that. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, suffered from leprosy. Elisha, the man of God, this is the next slide, sent a message to the king, let him come to me that he may learn there is a prophet in Israel. Next slide. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance of Elisha's house. Next slide. Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman, next slide, Naaman became angry and went away, saying, I thought he would come out and call on the name of the Lord his God. Going on, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Are not the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? He turned and went away in a rage. So he has a little bit different reaction in his situation. than the blind man had in his. Next slide. But his servant said to him, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? That's a really good question. Next slide. So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. Now that's impressive. To have the flesh of a young boy when you're not a young boy. Go from leprosy to that kind of condition. Amazing. And he was clean, or healed of his leprosy. Next slide. People said, how did your eyes get opened? We're jumping back to Jesus now. How did your eyes get opened? Well, let me stop there and just unpack the Old Testament story a little bit. Here we have pride getting in the way of this situation. He knows that there is help for him in the ministry of Elisha, the prophet of God. He knows that. But he doesn't drop his pride out of the way. When he comes, he wants to be treated by his helper in the way that he desires. And it kind of reminds me of my mom, a time or two. You know, she would go to the doctor, and the doctor just didn't quite treat her right, and she got miffed. And so she would come home and talk about it, and we would try and straighten her out. Well, you know, I think we all have pride, don't we? I mean, we all have that feeling that, you know, we know best. Everybody thinks their opinion's correct, right? I mean, you think that you're right, don't you? You know, Naaman he kind of got a little bit carried away with that. And he got in the way of his own healing. Fortunately, the time wasn't up for him when he moved forward. He got that healing anyway, but he had to humble himself and not have things exactly the way he wanted. Okay, now we go back to the story with Jesus in John 9. People said, how did your eyes get opened? They came and asked this formerly blind man, because they were amazed by this. Nobody had ever seen somebody that's blind be healed in this way, totally healed of blindness from birth. And so he explained to him, he said, a man named Jesus made a paste and rubbed it on my eyes and told me, go to Siloam and wash. I did what he said. When I washed, I saw. They came back at the blind man. You're the expert. He opened your eyes. What do you say about him? And the next slide, he said he is a prophet. I know one thing for sure. I was blind and now I see. He simplified the situation. He didn't really understand it. He knew what he had experienced. He knew that he had come in contact with Jesus, and as a result, now he saw. And, you know, I think that there's a lesson there. We have a tendency to go beyond what we know into what we suspect or, you know, have an opinion about. And if we stuck with more of what we know, I think we would have a better relationship with the people around us. Okay, so they were asking the wrong question, these apostles, disciples. They were looking for someone to blame. Jesus turned it around into something positive. Don't blame people, help people. And what good does it do to blame people? You know, we're all to blame for something. Now this story has struck me, and stories like it, from the beginning, because in my family we have a family member with severe handicap. My brother David was born deaf, totally deaf. And he had, beyond that, a thing called Usher's syndrome, which involved a later loss of his vision. When he got into his 20s, he began to see his vision taper off as well. And now he has very little vision at this point. He's about 9 years older than I am. And of course, you know, nobody wanted him to be deaf. Nobody wanted him to be blind. You know, he's been connected with the church since he was a baby. And yet he is still deaf. He is still blind in physical terms. When he was a child, some of the well-meaning folk in the church would say things to my parents like, well, just have faith and he'll be healed. And, that began to rankle after a while because you kind of get down to, as a parent, what can I do to make this better? And is it that I don't have enough faith that he continues to be in this state? Well, they had plenty of faith. David had plenty of faith, still does. But the physical manifestation has remained. And so I think sometimes our friends slip over into the category of asking the wrong question and speaking beyond their knowledge, and it doesn't help. But the story, what does the story mean to us? Is it something we go to as a how-to manual of how to get healed from physical blindness? Well, I don't think it is, and I'm not alone. I think it has to do with spiritual blindness, as Jeff said earlier. Spiritual blindness rather than physical blindness. And this goes way back in church history to read this in this way. St. Augustine, he suggested the blind man is the human race. He says this blind man stands for more than just someone with blindness. He stands for all of us, that we all have a tendency to be unable to perceive truth. And another one in church history, a little bit later on, Erasmus of Rotterdam. You may not have heard of him, but he was a very important person in his day. And for a long time afterwards, he lived in 1466 to 1536. And he was the person who created the authoritative text of the New Testament, both in Latin and in Greek. And of course, to us, nowadays, we see that the Greek is the more important. But in his day, the Latin was considered to be the more important one. But it was a translation of the Greek originals. And this was a huge task in those days to figure out what the correct words of the New Testament would be. He didn't do a perfect job. He let some people talk him into sticking one verse in where he probably shouldn't have done it. But what he created became known as the received text, and the Bibles that were translated off that in Europe for years and years afterwards, including the King James, they were based upon Erasmus's work. And he's been called the crowning glory of Christian humanists. And he is one who read this story symbolically, that it has to do not with physical blindness, but rather in our lives we need to interpret it to have to do with spiritual blindness. The story is rich in symbolism. One man says, Oysen Fiore, he says, light and darkness, sight and blindness, enlightenment, baptism. He says, in the early Christian communities, candidates for baptism presented their names to the local Christian community and for 40 days trained for baptism. During that time, they were joined by the local community, united in prayer and fasting. From at least the 3rd century, candidates were introduced to 3 great texts from John: the Samaritan woman, the man born blind, that's our story today, and the raising of Lazarus. These texts hold a key to discipleship. Each one is a story of healing. Each is an answer to the questions: how do you meet Jesus? How do you respond to him? So there's more here than just the story of a person that couldn't see physically. I want you to take a look at the bulletin, if you have a bulletin handy, and look at the music that was chosen for today's service. This is no coincidence. This is a conspiracy. Be thou my vision. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. The verse that we sang from Holy, Holy, Holy. Moving on down to our response to the hymn, Open my eyes that I may see. And Amazing Grace, I once was blind, but now I see. All of those hymns show the spiritual application of this story and stories like it. To see the truth is extremely important. It's something that we all need. But we all have a tendency to have less than perfect sight when it comes to perceiving reality. We all have our reasons to interpret reality in our own peculiar ways. But seeing the truth, how precious it is. And I think the crux of it is to see that life is more than just a random seeking of pleasure and avoidance of pain. To see that, to perceive it, is a major, major breakthrough. To see that there is something beyond this world that we call God. To not just think about that and theorize about it, but to believe it and know it, is to be healed spiritually of our blindness. Another thing I'm reminded of, this may seem weird, but let me see, is everyone awake? Pretty good, all right. Robert Burns wrote a poem a long time ago, and my English teacher in my high school over at Northwest Classen, when I was a little bit younger, she shared this with us. And he wrote this poem, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to give you the gist of it. Burns talks about seeing a woman that was just dressed to the nines, and she had her hair perfectly coiffed, and she had a beautiful bonnet on the top of her head. And as he was looking at her, he noticed a louse crawl out of her hair. And it really spoiled the picture for him. And so he wrote this poem, To a Louse. And I'll share that with you later. It's written in his dialect, which is a little hard for me to read or understand. But basically, he's cursing the louse for ruining the day. And he brings it all down to the last stanza, and in that he says, "Oh, would some power the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us." You probably heard that saying, and I think it comes from this poem. To see ourselves as others see us. To know that once in a while there's going to be a louse crawl out of my hair at the most inopportune moment. Yeah, it's going to happen. Yeah, it's going to happen. And then finally, I want to share something that came from Marilyn's desk upstairs. Christine found this, and she shared it with us. It's entitled The Dirty Wash. Things aren't always what they appear to be. A young couple moves into a new neighborhood. The next morning, while they are eating breakfast, the young woman sees the neighbor hang up the wash outside. "That laundry is not very clean," she said. "She doesn't know how to wash correctly. Perhaps she needs laundry soap." The husband looked on but remained silent. Every time her neighbor would hang out the wash, the young woman would make the same comment. About 1 month later, the woman was surprised to see a nice clean wash on the line and said to her husband, "Look, she has learned how to wash correctly. I wonder who taught her this." Her husband said, "I got up early this morning and washed the windows." And so it is with life. What we see while watching others depends on the purity of the window which we look through. And I say these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I'll take my tambourine and go away.